the working class ain't what it used to be. I'd like to introduce to you Owen Jones, who is an author and he's also a journalist. He's written this book. I don't think I need to mention what it's called, but I will. Charitable Demonisation of the Working Class. There's a bookstore at the back if you want to buy it. I'd also like to introduce Kat Boyd. She's a PCS activist and she's also chair of Glasgow Coalition of Resistance. And I'd also like to introduce Adrian Cousins, who's editor of Counterfire. We're going to be doing meetings, so it's about 30 minutes of the speakers, 30 minutes of the contributions, but I'd like to kick off by asking Kat Boyd to start.
Hi. I'm going to speak from a trade union perspective, and I think that I should start by saying that the last year has been one of the most crucial times for public sector trade unions, as we face the biggest attacks ever seen on our pensions, pay and the increasing threat of privatisation. And since PCS went out on June 30th, and on that day action joined by a handful of other unions, I'd like to say that there's been so many peaks and troughs, but actually there's really only been one peak, and that was November 30th, which was an absolutely incredible day, as people from all ages and all unions were in agreement, and they are still. The atmosphere on that day was incredible. And I think one of the other speakers mentioned in the last session, the support for that strike was incredible. Public support, 60%, which rose to 80%, people aged 24 and under. Now the left obviously played quite a crucial role inside and outside the trade unions in pushing for these strikes. The incredible spread of support for this action, but also the visibility that was created was incredible. For example, in Glasgow, we had the largest demonstration on the streets that we've seen since the anti-war movement. There was 20,000 people on the streets. That was replicated across the country. But very, very quickly after November 30th, the movement started to dip. I mean, the absolute scandal regarding the heads of agreement, the immediate expulsion from PCS from all negotiations, and Dave Prentice said that there would be more strikes in the new year. That was something he said on November 30th. Well, it's now the new year and I can see Dave Prentice not moving. And I think this exposes some of the major contradictions within the trade union movement, and they can be seen really clearly in this context. The most glaring contradiction is the crisis of democracy within the trade union movement. Now firstly, if members, say for example, Unison, voted to defend their pensions, took to the streets, organised pickets, gave up a day's wage, these members have been sold down the river. There was no unofficial walkouts in protest to what the leadership was doing. There was some pretty damp protests outside the TUC headquarters, but there was no counterweight to the bureaucracy of the leadership. There was no counterweight because essentially the rank and file organisation is weak. Now, secondly, there is a mood of quite radical hostility to the existing capitalist system, and it does exist. Within the trade union movement, that's been curtailed. This radical militant mood is being dampened down. The pull of the leadership, we can't ignore their affiliations to the Labour Party. N30 is a really good example of the way that the bureaucracy can turn on and turn off the struggle. I also want to speak from a young perspective, as a young trade unionist. And I think I've been thinking about my own experiences really. I was politically radicalised by the Stop the War movement. That Stop the War movement was absolutely crucial. That was the first mass movement that pushed imperialism into the forefront of mainstream consciousness for probably since the Vietnam War. Now, young people who are radicalised by the Stop the War movement are now finding themselves working in call centres, supermarkets, etc. There's a whole base of once radicalised, now deeply alienated young workers. This was a generation who were promised the world and saw none of it. Now, the radicalisation of youth is continuing on university campuses now, with things like Millbank, the anti-fees movements, the anti-cuts, occupations across the country, militant direct action. When those young people leave university and potentially, if they're lucky, find their way into work, what they'll find It's private sector jobs, low density, low trade union organisation and a hostile employer. History shows that it's growing industries employing young people is where new forms of trade unionism emerge. Young people are increasingly looking for new forms of organisation, of democracy that look to the Occupy movements. Now, there's a young section of the working class that I've certainly started to notice at demonstrations, 14, 15-year-olds who already hate the current system and they're looking for somewhere constructive to put their anger. The crisis is happening now, and that's the economic crisis and also the very real crisis of representation for young working people. We can't wait for a historical process to take place. We can't wait for the emergence of private sector trade unionism. As fighting trade unionists, we need to develop the rank and file. We need to look at we need to look at progressive, radical new forms of democracy that are emerging. Look to something like the occupied squares in Spain. Look at the Occupy movement as a way to advance and shape the unions just now. We need to begin to demand the creation of space inside and out with the workplace. Sorry, my notes are a bit of a mess here. So as I was saying, the strength of the rank and file is being curtailed by the leadership. So the rank and file should essentially act as a counterweight within the trade union movement itself. The nature of the union leadership round about N30 does show, like as I was saying, that the leadership have the ability to turn the struggle on and off. Trade unions are essentially defensive organisations, but even these defensive organisations can still shape consciousness. When people talk about low turnouts of trade union ballots, you need to look at what happens on the actual strike day. There's a very, very high level of participation. Now, obviously, one of the factors is the anti-trade union laws, the problems with postal ballots and so on. But there's something else, and it happens in my workplace. And I think you can only really, you can only know things from your own experience. People have the feeling that this will happen anyway. It doesn't matter really what you do in the election. The leadership will pull the workers out. And this leads to the final, the sort of conclusion here, is that people in workplaces don't have ownership of their own struggle. So we need to think of ways to make that happen, to make people feel that they actually own their struggle. I think it was raised in another meeting that the anti-trade union laws, something that I always viewed as an attack on trade union rights. It stops the union organising, it stops ballots, it becomes a logistical nightmare, but actually it's something much, much more sinister. The anti-trade union laws are anti-democratic. The example of anti-trade union laws is really good. I also think political strikes is very important just now. The legal nature of political strikes is key to this. Another speaker said in the last session that the public sector strike isn't about pensions, it's about something more. We need the rank and file to begin to interact on a larger social scale, to say it's not just about our pensions, it's actually about the wider social context. So we need to use the influences of new social movements to challenge this type of anti-democratic laws. We need to have challenges to the system. The confidence that can come on campuses and in communities of taking radical direct action can help do this. So look into something like the occupied squares in Spain. The right to free assembly. We need to have the right to free assembly in the workplace, to talk openly about industrial action at work, to talk about what's the best way forward. We need to have participation at a rank and file level where people can say, well, actually, I think this is the best way forward, to create those spaces. And we're now in a position to challenge that and to give people ownership. Now we need to allow unions to be influenced by these fast-paced movements like student occupations, the squares, where people take space for democratic participation. For example, in Madrid, when the police started to move in, people joined together and said, this is our democracy and you won't take it from us. But that act of rebellion is key, and that's what we need to start getting across within the rank and file. How do we do this? How do we build the rank and file? How do we strengthen the rank and file? I think it's complex, but there's one idea that people have been talking about all day today, and it's about the cross-fertilisation of struggle, the cross-fertilisation of a wider political movement. So saying the pension strike is not just about pensions, it's about the whole anti-austerity movement. That's where something like coalition resistance, for example, can come in. The widest possible movement of people who have an interest in something like the welfare state. We need to give workers the confidence to own their own struggle, not be at the mercy of the leadership, even if it's left-wing leaning, to turn the struggle on and off. The seeds of this new strong rank and file exist already in the workplace, like the students radicalised by the Stop the War movement, like people who are engaged in community activist groups. You know, the trade union movement doesn't exist in a vacuum. These rank and file workers exist in their communities, and the anti-austerity movement is so far-reaching that all the struggles have to be intertwined. Thank you.